Hi, welcome back. In this segment, we're going to talk about vehicle history reports and accidents and structural damage. All across America, you will see car dealers with big banners that say things like, "We only sell cars with clean vehicle history reports," or "We only sell vehicles with no reported accidents." Or they will advertise this car, no reported accidents, clean CarFax, clean AutoCheck, clean vehicle history report. And so customers very often buy those cars thinking, okay, this car has never been in an accident. Or they'll think, hey, this dealer only sells cars that have never been in accidents. That's a mistake to think that. They can tell you, we only sell cars with no reported accidents. That's different than telling you, we don't sell cars that have been in accidents. You hear the difference, right? No reported accidents, no accidents. That's totally different. It's actually very, very common that cars have been in accidents, they've had damage, and those accidents do not show up on the vehicle history reports. How is that possible? Those vehicle history reports, they're basically just like data collection centers. They simply collect data. Normally, when it comes to accidents, there are two primary ways that they would know the car has been in an accident. One would be a police report was filed. So let's say that, car gets into a crash, people call the police come and do a report, that gets reported to the collection centers, and then they will have a record that car has been in an accident. Another common way that it would show up on the vehicle history report is that there was an insurance claim. An accident happens, people call the insurance company, file a claim with their insurance, and then the insurance usually will report that to the entities such as CarFax and AutoCheck, and they're going to know about it. Now, let me ask you a question. How common is it, or how common might you guess it is, that cars get into accidents, but no one calls the police or reports it to the insurance company? Now, you might think it's unusual, but it's not. It's very, very, very common, I can assure you. So let me just give you a few different scenarios so you kind of understand how this happens and why it happens, and you realize it's actually a very common thing. Imagine that someone is driving home after they've been to the club or to the pub, and they've maybe had a couple of drinks, and they get into an accident. Maybe they run off the road or they hit something. In that circumstance, they may be a little bit intoxicated or what have you, but they're probably sober enough to realize, like, hey, I probably don't want to call the police. Just like the drinking. Somebody is under the influence of drugs. They have drugs in the car. They have other illegal items in the car. Accident happens. If they can get away from it, they don't want anybody to know about it, so they're not going to call the police. Another case, just imagine that you're someone who, for whatever reason, is a little bit scared of the police, or let's just say, would rather avoid the police for whatever reason. If you're that person, an accident happens, you're probably not going to call the police. You don't want to talk to the police. All right, let's imagine another one. Let's say that you've been in a couple of accidents and your insurance premiums are high. Let's say that you have a $1,000 deductible on your policy. Now you get into an accident, you have some damage on your car, and you're thinking, like, this might cost, $1,000 to fix. Well, your deductible's $1,000. So if you call the police and sit there on the side of the road for a couple of hours waiting for the police to come, you got to waste a bunch of time. You got to deal with the police, do the reports, and then you call your insurance company. They're going to tell you that you have a $1,000 deductible anyway. So all of that hassle, plus you're still going to pay for it out of pocket, and your insurance rates are probably going to go up because you have another accident on your record. In that case, you're probably not going to call the police or the insurance company. How common is that? It's very common. Let me give you some others. You go to the dealer to buy a car, no matter a new car or a used car. Where did the car come from? Do you think they all sprouted up there? No. Do you think they were all driven directly to the lot? Probably not. Very commonly, cars are transported to the dealer's lot on a transporter truck. So you've got a truck, often two tiers. There are cars on the top, cars on the bottom. Depending upon the size of the truck, there may be 7, 8, 9 cars on there. Those cars have to be secured to the truck so they don't fall off going down the road. So there are some different ways that they secure them. It's very common that they'll put chains into the underside of the car and basically into the frame rails of the car, and then they'll chain down to the trailer and they'll ratchet them down really, really tight to hold the cars on there. Now the frame rails on unibody cars, they're actually fairly thin. So what happens sometimes with all that pressure on there, sometimes the chains actually end up ripping the frame, like literally just rip a gouge through the frame and cause frame damage or structural damage to the car. Now in that case, what does the dealer know about it? Well, in some cases, the transporter might just drive the car off the trailer and say, hey, here's your car. And then the dealer says, okay, car looks good. They don't even realize that the frame has been ripped underneath, thereby, causing this car to now have structural damage and maybe to even be an unsafe vehicle, but definitely to have its value impaired. Typically, they're going to drive the car out onto the lot and list it for sale, and you could be the unsuspecting customer who buys that car off the front line. Again, it's got frame damage on it that is not disclosed to you and doesn't show up on any of the reports. I mentioned the transporter trucks in some cases causing what they call tie-down tears, where the frame gets torn by the chains, holding the car down onto the truck. Now that actually is a pretty common thing, happens quite a bit. That's not the only type of damage though that can happen on a transporter truck. All kinds of damage can happen. When those cars are parked onto the trailer, sometimes they get it too close. When they're going down the road, they kind of bump up and down. Sometimes the cars rub against each other. In that case, it arrives at its destination. It just gets repaired usually. Are they going to call the police? No. Are they going to tell, an insurance company that's going to show up on AutoCheck? No. It's normally going to be, if the transporter pays for it, it's going to be a commercial insurance where they basically just pay out of their fund. And they're going to pay for it and just fix it. It doesn't show up on the history report, and normally nobody's going to tell you about it, and you wouldn't know unless you know how to see it for yourself. This happens on new cars and used cars, and it is actually very common. Some other ways cars get damaged on transporter trucks, sometimes they may put the car on the bottom layer. The trailers are adjusted by hydraulics. And I've seen it actually happen a lot of times where they end up bringing the top layer when they're adjusting it. They bring it down too low and crush the roof of the car down below. In that case, those cars sometimes suffer pretty massive damage, and they're often just simply repaired and sold. And nobody tells you about it. It doesn't show up on the history report because nobody called the police or reported it to an insurance company. It's going to show up on the history report. That happens a lot. I have seen fires happen on transporter trucks where cars get damaged by flames. Cars get, fire damage. And again, they usually just get fixed and sold and nobody tells you about it. I've seen transporter trucks drive down a street that they shouldn't drive down where there are trees hanging over the road. They're a little bit too low and the truck is very tall. They end up driving through some large tree limbs. The tree limbs smack the cars and cause extensive damage down the sides of the vehicles, the roofs of the vehicles, sometimes causing thousands of dollars of damage per vehicle. Doesn't show up on the history reports. Why? Because the cars arrive at the dealer, they simply fix them and sell them to you without telling you about it. That is common. Other types of damage that happens, I've seen many times where people maybe hit something in the road or maybe even in a parking lot, drive over a curb. The curb hits the underneath of the car, damages the frame rails of the vehicle. The person maybe gets the car off of the curb. They hear scraping noises, whatever, but they get it off of the curb. And then they just walk around the car and say, I think my car's fine. They try to drive it, take off driving, and say, okay, my car drives fine. I think it's okay. Well, the car may have some pretty extensive damage underneath. The frame may be damaged, but they don't know. They don't call the police. They don't call the insurance company. It's just there. Nobody's going to tell you about it unless you know how to look for it for yourself. So I hope you're beginning to see that what you always have to consider with vehicle history reports, the most famous ones are CarFax and AutoCheck, but what you have to always remember is they only know what's been reported to them. And there are many, many things that don't get reported to them. I want you to understand how important it is that you not rely exclusively on history reports. You can look at them. Sometimes they give some useful information that you would want to know. Sometimes they can reveal some surprises. You'd be like, oh, okay, that's great to know. Maybe it'll say this vehicle was a manufacturer buyback, is a limit. And the history report shows you that right away. Oh, okay, that's useful to know. Or it'll say something like, salvage title, and say, okay, well, that's good to know up front. Very often a salvage car will have a title that actually says salvage on it. Sometimes not. Sometimes people wash the titles, which is another topic we may talk about a little bit later. But essentially, if a car has been salvaged and then later it gets rebuilt, and then if you take it to a different state and get it retitled, take it to another state, you move it between states, sometimes it ends up coming up with a clean title that the unsuspecting person wouldn't know that car was a salvage car. As you can see, there are so many cases where cars get into accidents and it does not show up on the history report. An even bigger issue than that is structural damage. Frame damage almost never shows up on a history report. Why is that? Well, when a car gets into a crash, the police come out and do a report. They would just say vehicle had an accident. Now, are they going to record the exact details of how bad the damage was and if the frame was damaged? Police don't know how to do that, and that's not what they do. They just record accident happened. So they're not going to report that there was structural damage. Now, same thing with insurance companies. Typically, the insurance company, if they pay a claim, they basically just say, okay, we'll pay to have this car fixed. And they don't really want to talk about topics like, oh, the frame was damaged, this car is never going to be the same again. They don't talk about that. They just say, we're going to try to kind of repair it to where it kind of looks okay again. Is the car going to be as nice as it was before? Usually not. Are they really going to put it back to the condition as if it was never an accident? Probably not. If the frame was damaged, are they going to give you a new frame? No, they're not. And they don't want to talk about that. They want to pay as little as possible just to send you on your way. And so the insurance companies do not report that the frame was damaged. Usually, structural damage doesn't show up on a history report unless it's reported by an auto auction. Cars are sold at the auctions and they will disclose that there was structural damage on the car, and that will show up on the report. That actually is not very common though. And cars are very, very often sold at the car auctions with structural damage that is not disclosed. Nobody says a word about it. And, it's actually very, very common. So what I can tell you is that in most cases, when there is structural damage on a car, and this is very, very common, is very, very common that cars have structural damage on them, cars all over the place like that. It almost never shows up on history reports. I said almost never. It sometimes does, but really, it usually does not show up on the reports. So you have to know how to look for it and find it yourself. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a pretty good idea of how whatever you see on the history report, you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, so to speak. It could be useful, but you must combine this with some skill of knowing how to assess that car yourself. The only truly reliable history report is the car itself. That's why a lot of times when I'm looking at cars, if the owner of the car is there and they start to tell me all about it, and I say, okay, that's great. I'm interested in hearing that, but I would like to look at this car and I'd like the car to tell me its history. And that car speaks for itself. I always think to myself, I let the car speak for itself, because that is more important than any history report on paper. It's more important than what anybody tells me. It's more important than what anybody tells you. Usually a salesperson doesn't know the real history. Usually the dealership doesn't know the whole history. The vehicle history reports don't know all the history. But the car has the evidence in itself. The only truly reliable history report is the car itself. You simply have to know how to read it. And that's what we teach you at Buy Pros.